Hello everyone and welcome to the Priceless Podcast. My name is Michael Sechen and this podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. Subscribe, like, comment and share with whomever you like, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you want to support this podcast, you can find how to do so in the podcast description. My guest today is Jamie Marich. I want to say it in Croatian because her heritage is Croatian. She's from the United States and she is a clinical trauma specialist. She's an expressive artist. She's a writer and she's so much more. Well, some things maybe she will say herself. Jamie, hello and welcome to the Priceless Podcast.
Thank you, Michal. Hvala. It's my honor and pleasure to be here chatting with you.
So before we get into the topic of today, I haven't even said what it's going to be about, but is there anything else that you would like us to know about you before we start the podcast or the interview about the topic?
So I am, as you said, a Croatian American, and I'm a bisexual woman who is out in all areas of my life now, personally and professionally. It was a long, evolving journey to do both. And I just have a great passion for talking about the subject we'll be talking about today. And I'll let you go ahead and set that up.
Okay, good. So, my first question is, the topic that we're going to talk about is religious trauma, spiritual abuse. So maybe we can start off with you explaining what is religious trauma and what is spiritual abuse.
Yes, so spiritual abuse, in my view, is the broader term, and religious trauma narrows it down a little bit. So the core definition of abuse is any time there's a power differential and that power differential is used to wield power and control over the other individual in a way that uses shaming and other destructive tactics. And most people are aware of abuse in the context of sexual abuse, physical abuse, even emotional and verbal abuse. Yet spiritual abuse is not as often discussed, yet for those of us who have experienced it, it's this sense of, yes, of course, people can be abused spiritually. And so the working definition I've really leaned into, based both in my personal experience and from my academic study, is spiritual abuse is whenever God is used as the weapon. And it doesn't necessarily have to be God. It can be any spiritual construct like enlightenment or samadhi, as is often used in a lot of yogic or meditation contexts. So that's the broad context. Religious abuse can be when that specifically happens in the context of religion. So there was a term coined called religious trauma syndrome back in the early 90s that really spoke to that phenomenon happening inside church structures, inside more ecclesial structures. Yet why I've really leaned into spiritual abuse is that it doesn't just happen in religion. I have believed and I've experienced that some of the most powerful spiritual or religious abuse can happen in the home when you have very devout parents who are using their ideas of God as this weapon to control and shame and demean. And oftentimes spiritual abuse does happen in concert with other forms of abuse. The sexual abuse, spiritual abuse blend is one that's very known because oftentimes sexual abusers, whether they are clerical figures or parents, will say this is what God wants, or make the child or the victim feel like they're somehow being unforgiving if they can't immediately forgive the abuser for harming them sexually. So that's kind of the short explanation. But as you well know, for those of us who do identify as queer, LGBT, there can be a lot of nuance with how we experience it.
Well, you maybe answered it, but maybe you can say a little bit more about what's so specific about religious trauma compared to other trauma. Is there a difference? Because I also heard that there are some clinicians and some therapists who would really like to coin this term, that it's really recognized as a real thing. So what's the difference between this trauma and some other trauma?
Well, that's a great question. I think for many of us who've experienced it, we were just talking about this on a clinician's forum yesterday, especially those of us who've experienced this and other forms of trauma, this one feels like it bites the worst. Because the idea of spirit or connection or identity to something greater than ourselves is often very important to those of us who end up getting wounded by church or by devout parents. A big question that comes up is how can maybe 2 or 3 children who survive the same home under the same religious practices go through all of this, but one ends up getting seriously affected and the others don't? And usually when that happens, it's because the one who gets seriously affected really desires some deeper connection. People who we might generally refer to as old souls, or those who have more of an inherent connection in spirit to them. Those of us who've often been labeled as sensitive, as an insult. Yeah. I do think a lot of that are our spiritual gifts that we carry with us for deep empathy and deep connection. So I just think for a lot of us, this kind of abuse really cuts to the core of our identity. And then I think even within spiritual abuse and religious trauma, the more I've studied my own and others, there's even a subset of the trauma that comes towards queer and LGBT folks, because it's like 2 of our identities can be clashing with each other in this sense. And as you know, so many of us hear things like, well, you can't really be a Christian or you can't really love God if you're queer. And many of us have been guilty of diving so deeply in to the practices to pray the gay away or to somehow have God relieve me of this. And many of us get to this point where it's like, we've tried that for years. And eventually we come to peace with this sense of, this is just how God made me, and realize that there are even other theologians who see the same. And you know how this happens. And then we can get the wounding again from people who chastise us for accepting ourselves. And I do think queer and LGBT folks get hit hard with spiritual abuse. I think women globally get hit hard with spiritual abuse because so many religious systems are set up to be so patriarchal, where women just have no voice, no rights. So I remember an early collaborator of mine would say, I think every woman on the planet has been exposed to spiritual abuse, and I tend to agree with her.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. So what kind of spiritual abuse do you think happens the most often? I don't know if it's even possible to...
It's a great question. Yeah. So to answer that question, I want to explain there are 3 kind of different kinds of spiritual abuse that I see if we're classifying them. There's spiritual abuse in the home. Parent to child, grandparent to child, guardian to child. There's spiritual abuse in religious institutions, whether it be the church, the synagogue, the religious community, the spiritual community. And then there's spiritual abuse at the level of the state, which is where you have totalitarian regimes that dictate the laws of their citizens based usually on the most conservative readings of a certain religion. And when I grew up, especially then when I started studying this, when I heard about spiritual abuse at the level of the state, my immediate thought went to places like Iran. And then coming of age in the United States and seeing what has happened with the formation of our Supreme Court and how so many laws have been overturned. And even, as I've talked with you about, asking how free really are countries in Europe where there's so much Catholic Church influence. So we could make the argument that it exists at the level of state. So we have the home, we have the religious institutions, we have the state. And I don't know which necessarily happens most frequently, because I think they can all have their own bite. They can all have their own sting depending on the individual. And maybe this answer is biased from my personal experience, but I do think at the level of the home is the most insidious, maybe not most insidious, it can be the most harming long term. Because when you're a child, if you want your basic needs taken care of for food, water, and shelter, your parent is your God. And if that parent and their face of God in your life comes with just a lot of vitriol and a lot of hate that they believe they have a right to impart because God told them so, this idea of authority, it could make the experience just very unsafe for a child growing up. Unsafe, they might be safe physically, but emotionally they may not be. So I think one then could make the same argument if you're living in a country or a state where you're trapped because of who you are as a woman or as a marginalized person, that can also be its own degree of torture. So hope that gives you some clarity on the types.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying about parents, because, it makes sense that it's so important, or that it is the most harming, because one of the most important things for us is that our parents accept us. It's something, when our parents don't accept us, it's much harder to deal with than when other people don't accept us. I think that's kind of, this connection. I like the image that you used when we are small. Our parents are God to us, they're everything. We idolize them. So let's say I experienced religious trauma, but am not aware that I have it. How can I be aware that I'm suffering of religious trauma?
That's a I love that question. My short answer is, if at any time you've ever wondered, is this torture I'm feeling at the hands of the church or at the hands of religion? Is this trauma? Is this right? Then you probably have experienced it on some level. Because I remember having a moment in my high school years, about 16, 17 years old. So my home journey was a little interesting because my parents are both Croatian. They were married in the Roman Catholic Church. And when I was 5, my father converted to evangelical Christianity. And he thought our whole Croatian family was going to hell because they were Catholics, because that was the kind of evangelicalism he believed in. So a lot of my spiritual torture came at the hands of the two of them, like, fighting over me and what religion I would end up being. And here I had a mother who stayed firm in her Catholic values, which came with their own level of rigidity in some ways. But I had a father who was the angrier parent that was constantly condemning her to hell and fighting over me. So I remember laying in my room one day and I wonder if spiritual abuse is a real thing. Because that's certainly what this feels like, what I'm going through. And then I kind of shelved it in the back of my head, and I went through a lot more years of torture and addiction and struggle and coming out to myself. And then years later, when I was in graduate school, I was probably about 24 years old, I had an opportunity to write a paper on an open topic for a course that I took. And I remembered that moment because even then I was deconstructing my Catholicism, which I had ended up choosing at the time. And I said, I wonder if that spiritual abuse thing is real. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, it was a term that had been codified and other people had written about it, just some fledgling research about it. And so if you ever had a moment similar to what I described, where you're wondering, is this right? Or is this legitimate? And I tell people all the time in my clinical work that if the word trauma or abuse feels too big for you, because for a lot of us, it does. A lot of us, we've been trained, because this was a spiritually abusive trope I got in my house, which is people have it so much, you have it so much better than other people in the world. And even when I first learned what trauma was, I said, I didn't survive a war. I didn't this, I didn't that. And my recovery mentor wisely said to me, maybe the war was your house. And for a lot of people, the war zone is their church or their community and their house. So if the word trauma or abuse feels too big to you, use the word wound. The English word trauma that we're using comes from Greek meaning wound. And I think many of us, especially if we're queer, otherwise LGBT, can admit we've been wounded at the hands of religious people or by the mouths of religious people. So I would say start there and then know it's valid and continue exploring how it's affected you.
For me, what I realize, it's so hard to see the difference of the abuse that was inflicted by church, but also the things that I inflicted on myself. Do you know what I mean? Because of some rules that we learn while we grow up in church, we actually forbid ourselves to be. Just to be. And it's so hard, like sometimes I realized it's so hard to struggle or say, oh yes, I was abused, because they didn't do anything like openly. It's more it was more what I was doing to myself.
So I know of what you speak, and it is similar to this concept of internalized homophobia or internalized transphobia, that and it's a survival tactic. The only way we feel we can survive living in this world that's surrounded, it's if you can't beat them, join them. We'll say that in English. So you turn it inside. And shoot, I'm still unpacking some of those tendencies I have to turn it inward and automatically self-flagellate. And I'm grateful I have conversations like this where I can recognize, oh, other people do it too. This must have been a survival strategy. And it's interesting because I studied with a yoga teacher from India, and even though this teaching he ended up using abusively at times, I like this idea that he would share that, no, nobody's abused you as much as you've abused yourself. In terms of, turning it inward, what you're talking about. Where it becomes a spiritually abusive teaching, and this is another form of spiritual abuse, is when abusers will then say something like that to say, well, you're doing it to yourself. And so I think that's another part of this discussion to have, is how so many teachings that can be inherently beautiful, like forgiveness, get used and weaponized. So much so that the idea of forgiveness has become a dirty word to me. And I don't like that, because I do think it is fundamentally a healthy and nourishing practice to be able to forgive. Yet it's weaponized, and that word weaponized just keeps coming up. There's something wrong with you if you can't forgive these people who did horrible things to you, instead of putting the responsibility where it belongs, on the systems that are doing the harm.
I mean, at the end, forgiveness, I don't think forgiveness is for someone else. It's for myself. And it has to do a lot with healing. I don't want to feel angry all the time. I don't want to be angry with those people. I want to continue my life and be as happy as I can. Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, we never learned, forgiveness as something we do for ourselves, because then we are too selfish. We are not allowed to be selfish, to do things for ourselves. We are supposed to do things for others and only for others. Later, when I started to learn a lot about nonviolence and nonviolent communication and about our needs as human beings, I realized, well, actually, all of the things we do for a selfish reason in some way, because we do things and we gain something at the end. And I'm actually happy that it's like that, because that's pushing us to do good things because we feel good when we do good things. So, I'm thinking of maybe some viewers and listeners who are part of the church and don't really understand. Maybe they're not LGBT, or maybe they still are, but don't really understand. There is a lot of spiritual abuse coming when we come out. Why is it so important for you to come out? I hear that question. Like, why is that so important? And I think it is, but maybe from your point of view as a therapist, what would you say? Why is it so important?
Yeah, I first want to acknowledge, especially since it's Pride Month when we're recording this, that your safety does come first. And I realize there are certain countries, certain cultures, certain contexts where it just may not feel safe to fully come out. So I referenced earlier in this interview, the first coming out I had to do was to myself. And that's hard work in and of itself, to be able to say, yeah, this is who I am. And then from there, you decide kind of the trajectory that your coming out takes as you evaluate your safety. Yet, with those considerations being in place, I think there are two important reasons for coming out. One is more personal, one is more societal. Personally, you may notice just how much better you feel when you're not having to put up a mask all the time in every area of your life. And connected to this podcast, something I hear a lot, and I know this has been my experience, it might not be everybody's experience, I actually deepened my relationship with God when I came out, because I no longer resented God as much and was really able to fall into this place of, God loves me as I am. This is how my Creator made me. And I just saw scriptures and Christian texts and even other faith teachings that I've studied, because I have a very ecumenical spirit, just in a very different way. So yeah, there's risk for sure that comes with living authentically, because it could turn your whole life upside down. Yet I know so many of us just feel better psychologically for having done it. Now, societally, like many queer Americans, Harvey Milk is one of my historical icons. He was the first openly gay mayor of an American city. And he was very big on this message that we have to come out, we have to come out. So much so that a lot of his cohort challenged him on that, saying it may not be safe in certain contexts. But he said the mainstream won't know how many of us there are until we come out. So many people who say such hateful things about LGBT folks, queer folks, may not realize who they're talking to. And then once they start to see that, yes, there are more of us, and there are different kinds of us, because I find that so many people who spew hate about queer folks, they're operating off of stereotypes. And not to say that people who embody the stereotypes are bad in any way. Yet I think folks are amazed when they realize, yeah, that person next door, that person I sit next to at church, they're a good person. They love Jesus. They love God. There's this idea just in social justice teaching that exposure is necessary for changing hearts and minds. And I have seen conservative people maybe not completely change their beliefs, but at least change their way of viewing how they treat others as a result of them getting to really know queer people.
Yeah, I met some of those people too, and it's amazing how I remember this one pastor who said, I still don't know what to do with LGBT people in the church, but I do believe they need to have rights. They need to have human rights, and I'm going to stand up for their rights in society. And I was just like, okay. It was, for me, it was a very strange combination, but I was still admiring, that she can separate these two things. She didn't know what to do with it, but still she was standing up for LGBT people, which was really, really amazing. What would you say? You talked about parents and how parents can actually do the biggest harm. So if any parents are listening, what kind of guidance or wise words would you give them, how to, I don't know, if they maybe don't know what to do with their LGBT or Q child?
What's coming in my heart is really listen to your children. Really listen to your children. And I know that involves possibly putting your personal ego aside to do that. And it may involve challenging a lot of what you've learned from institutional religion. And I realize that especially, in our part of Europe where our people come from, there can be a lot of this connection that the church defines who I am. And sometimes I've even sat back and I've wondered, why do people treat folks so horribly and defend the church like it's this most sacred thing ever? And the answer I've really come up with is because so many people don't know who they would be without the church. And I think I would tell parents that, God, if assuming that part of your hesitancy is because of your religion, God is bigger than church. And I had a priest tell me that. A priest who I was really working with earlier in my recovery when I was struggling to make sense of the difference between church and institution. And I personally believe, and a parent might find this useful, it's on my heart to share it as well. Even though institutional religion is just not where I'm at anymore because I've seen the harm it's caused to myself and to others, I still maintain a Christian identity, a Catholic Christian identity. And one of the reasons I could do that is because of the teaching of the Incarnation. This idea that God thought it would be cool to become human. I mean, that's a very American way to say it. And yet the theology interpretations are there. Some people think it was as human sacrifice to die for our sins. But no, I mean, I love people so much. The different types of people I've met in my work, in my travels, in my study, in my personal life, that is where I see God, is through hearts and connections with other people. And I've ever asked, I'm going to ask a parent, have you ever really experienced God's wonder in the presence of your child? Because if that's the case, trust that. That is bigger than church. So even what I just shared may be a little hard for some parents to hear, yet it's what I would like to share with you all these years down the road. Having had two parents fight so much about religion. Why? Especially when people are seriously affected by it.
What about religious institutions? I know there are religious institutions who really try to do better. Like, where do they even start? Where do they even begin if they want to change or go deeper and see where do we practice spiritual abuse?
And that's rough because, as we know, a lot of religious institutions sanction discrimination towards LGBTQ folks and sanction discrimination towards women. So I think your question's twofold. There could be if you're working in a more progressive church and if you're working in a more conservative church. But even if you are working in a more conservative church, where the dogma dictates what you can teach, you can still be kind to people. You can still be kind to people. That goes a long way. You can still, especially if you're interacting with youth one-on-one, or if you're a priest hearing confessions, treat them as a human. And you can use a line like, well, the church teaches, yet this is what I want to tell you person to person. So I didn't mention yet, as part of my story in this interview, my brother's a Catholic priest. My brother came out of our home and he really found his refuge in Catholicism, and he's a Catholic priest, and we disagree theologically on a lot of things. Yet I'm out to him. It was a lovely experience overall coming out to him. Sometimes I struggle with, what does he really think of me? And we're so misaligned on some things. Yet he has continued to treat me with kindness and love. And I know that's not so many people's experiences dealing with priests or other people in religious institutions. And I think the other thing is what you mentioned earlier in the interview. When religious leaders can say things like, we have done harm to certain communities, and if possible, we want to fight for your rights at a civil level, because I think that's another thing churches can really model, which is, the church can teach what the church wants to teach, as far as I'm concerned, as unjust as I think it might be. Yet, where I really get activated is when you try to impose those rights on a civil level. And so with whatever churches can do to take a stand about, okay, this is what the church teaches, yet your rights ought to be protected, that is a beautiful thing. Now, for churches that are more affirming, like the Lutheran Church, a lot of branches of the Lutheran Church or the Episcopal Church, and some just non-denominational ministries form because of this connection or commitment to be more affirming, that is where you can really do your work around validating a lot of the harm people have experienced in other systems. And then to ask, what are your needs in this community? So the same principles, treating people like people, treating people with human dignity, but really being open to feedback as much as possible about what you as the faithful need this community to be. Because yes, even progressive, affirming congregations and institutions can get into toxic patterns, because that's part of the beast of institutionality. Yeah. So I think being continuously willing to get feedback and have open conversations and affirm publicly when you can. I want to give a shout out to a ministry that is based in Europe that I think many listeners of the podcast would find lovely. It's called Abbey of the Arts. And it was formed by a Third Order Benedictine and her husband. He is a theologist by background, taught at a high school level. She is a Christian spiritual director who's an expressive artist. And they formed this lovely ministry about 15 years ago, and it's continued to evolve. And one of the reasons I have found such a home there, and I sit on their board and I do guest teaching, is they engage in a lot of not just the Christian, but the ancient Catholic practices that I really love. And there's a huge devotion of St. Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, in this organization. Yet there is complete, because it's not connected to the church, even though they are Benedictines. It's an independent ministry. Yesterday, Christine proudly put out a blessing for Pride. And we have an openly trans minister on our Wisdom Council, on our board as well. And I have told her this several times. I've shared this in other writing of mine, and I'm saying it here publicly. I cannot tell you what a difference being involved in that kind of ministry has made to me, where I can engage in practices I love, but not once be made to feel less than because of who I am. In fact, it's affirmed.
Oh, I definitely want to put the link of what you mentioned just now in the podcast description, so check it out. Yeah, when you were talking about institutions and kind of questioning the institutions, a question came to my mind. Is it possible for an institution not to be abusive? Like a religious institution? When you have these guidelines of, what you believe and how you have to believe it, do you have any experiences? Is it possible, or it's just some people that will always maybe experience something as an abuse?
Well, I think part of what makes institutions ripe to be abusive is they could naturally set up a power differential. That we are above the faithful, and some of the more time-established institutions like the Catholic Church, I think, have that longevity, that history backing. I mean, I think wherever you have people, there's going to be fallibility. There's going to be the potential for causing harm. And I know there are certain organizations and communities I've experienced, like the Abbey, where I've had wonderful experiences, but I can't promise that's everybody's experience there. So I think, again, institutions aren't the enemy, but this idea of institutionality comes when we hold the sacredness or the protection of that institution above the feelings and dignity of people. And whenever institutions cover for abuse, especially, that is where there's an immediate cause for concern.
While you were talking, I was thinking, maybe this is out of place because we already went a little bit farther away. But I'm still kind of thinking about the spiritual abuse of church. You talked a little bit more about the parents and how big the harm is. And when we talk about church or religious institutions, it's very clear. The spiritual abuse is very clear, especially, at least to us and people who went through conversion therapy. Like, conversion therapy is probably something that is out there, and you can very easily say this is spiritual abuse. But there is so much micro violence within religious institutions that we are not aware of. And I'm thinking, is it possible for you to maybe mention some of these, smaller or minor ways of abuse that religious institutions are inflicting on people?
Well, what you're talking about, microaggression, is a term we use a lot, and a couple other people I do social justice work have said microaggression is still aggression. It's this idea of wound, that yes, you could get wounded by a gunshot, you can get wounded by one paper cut, but if that one paper cut becomes 1,000 paper cuts and it starts to get infected, it's still going to hurt the person. I mean, I think a lot of it can come in the forms of snide comments that are made from the pulpit during homilies or during lectures or during sermons about this country is lost to God because of the scourge of abortion, homosexuality. And so I've been through many homilies and sermons in both churches where when this person in authority is just putting that out there so publicly that if you are a queer kid sitting there hearing that, or if you're a woman sitting there hearing that, how might the whole wives submit to your husband scripture, that is one of the scriptures that can be used in Catholic weddings. as I like to say, as I was a queer little feminist soul sitting through so many church services, hearing things like this, of course it was microaggressive, but I also didn't think I had a right to say anything at that point. And it often doesn't happen until we're out of that environment for a while that we see just how harmful it is on us.
I guess what you said, try to listen what it's doing to people, whatever you're saying. I remember one pastor who said that women who make an abortion and homosexuals bring death to society. You're like, okay.
And an interesting comment I can make, especially as a bisexual woman who has been previously married to two cisgender men, is that a lot of people, both in church institution and in some of the academic institutions I've dealt with, they don't know who they're talking to. So they can be having a conversation with me and make a dig about the gay agenda or the politics of homosexuality and kind of roll their eyes subtly. And that's one of the reasons I knew I personally had to come out professionally. And some of the resistance that I got in my family and in some friend circles is, well, why do you have to come out? Why do you have to make a big deal about it? Because it's like you pass the societal norms. And even hearing that is what made me know I had to come out. Because I've gotten a lot of the microaggressions over the years because people don't automatically assume I'm queer because I am cisgender, feminine presenting, and have traditionally partnered with men. Yeah.
When you said, just hearing that question, I knew I had to come out. So the right answer is someone asks us, just say, that's why. So we talked about spiritual abuse, we talked about religious trauma, and let's say that some of the listeners and viewers realize, oh, they're talking about me. So what are some ways to find healing, to get to a better place, to deal with religious trauma? And of course, you can talk about some things that are connected to therapy, but I want you to have in mind that we also have viewers and listeners who probably don't have the money to have therapy, or don't have someone they can talk to openly about their LGBT identity. What would you say is the way to get some healing?
I think there's a lot of healing that can be had in connecting with others and realizing, wow, I'm not some uniquely horrible person. Or, wow, so many other people have gone through this too. I think that's the reason why many, at least in the US, I don't know how it is in Europe, but many of us who grew up in spiritually toxic systems can't get enough when like a cult documentary comes on TV or some documentary exposing a church or abusive system, because it feels like, wow, other people went through this too and some justice was had. For people who can't afford therapy, and even if you can afford or access therapy, not every therapist is necessarily attuned to what spiritual abuse is. So I'll get there though in a second. Your social platforms can be a good place. Like this podcast, I think, is an amazing service where people can hopefully hear other folks' stories and connect. I'm a big TikToker as of last year. It took me a while to get on the platform. Yet there is a wonderful, in English, it'd be deconstruction TikTok is the hashtag, where so many videos, especially of queer folks sharing their stories about what they went through at the hands of church. And I've made a couple good friends on the platform just connecting to content. So I think a lot of healing can be had through the mutual sharing of experience, and whatever social platform you navigate, you'll likely find some kind of group there of survivors of your religion or queer survivors. And some people, I would imagine this would apply to a lot of people who listen to this podcast, do still identify as a person of faith or want to embrace faith in some way. So yeah, you'll find your folks. Reading resources, I mentioned Abbey of the Arts. There's another US-based resource that's amazing called reclamationcollective.com, and it is a group of therapists, but they put out a lot of information for the general public. Patheos.com is a progressive faith type of site. They're out there. And so even as you're searching them, see where you feel a resonance. And yeah, you may notice getting some resources and reading can be super helpful. I know when we met in person, we talked about Nadia Bolz-Weber, the Lutheran minister. Yes. Her book, Shameless, I highly recommend to queer folks who have gone through church, because I find it to be a theologically very sound book and also very affirming and relevant for the times. So those are just some ideas. And then to really kind of get out some of what is held inside you. I am also, in addition to the trauma therapies I do, I'm an expressive artist, expressive arts therapist. And by definition, that means working with any available creative form you have to access, often in combination. So it may be keeping an art journal where you can write some of your thoughts in the form of poetry or just free-form verse. Perhaps do some arting or collaging or scrapbooking, putting together a playlist, a music playlist of your journey thus far. That's a practice I really lean into. So yeah, there's healing is out there. It's at your disposal. It often comes from making connections like this. That's how I met you. Was I reached out to another LGBT organization and they introduced me to you. And I think when you do have just a little bit of whatever faith may remain to reach out, you could find it. And who's ever listening to this, know that you are not alone. And regardless of how religious people may have made you feel, you are not alone. I get it. So many of us get it. And we just want to let you know, especially if you are still a person of faith, like that priest told me, God is bigger than the church. God is bigger than the rules of any given church.
I love all your suggestions. Thank you so much for giving us some tools that we can use to work on our healing. Is there anything else that you think is so important to say about religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and I haven't asked you, or maybe something else that you would like to add?
I think we've covered an amazing range of topics today. I'm glad you brought up conversion therapy as a form of spiritual abuse that people go through. The book Boy Erased, which was also made into a movie, is another, I think, required source of, because some people actually went off to camps or saw really abusive church therapists, yet for a lot of us it came in more subtle ways. This Pray Away the Gay, Pray Away on Netflix is another one that, take good care of yourself if you're going to watch that, because it's intense. So even though I think had I come out younger, I would have been sent away somewhere. So that was one of the advantages of coming out later. Yet, just know that, you are exactly who you're supposed to be, and anything people do to try to change you to conform to their version of God is way more about them. It's all about them. So, I guess I'll just end with that note.
Thank you, Jamie, so much. I loved the way that you kind of implemented your own story through what you were saying. You know, it wasn't just about psychology, about the theory of everything, but it was you in everything. So I'm so thankful for the way, and I felt so comfortable talking to you about this topic. Thank you. I'm glad that after such a long time I found someone that I can talk about this topic, because it has been on my heart for a long time, because I think it's so important to talk about spiritual abuse and religious trauma, especially because of what you said, that we don't feel alone, because it's not just me who experienced it, and that I know and have some confirmation the pain is real. And it's here, I'm not making it up. I went through a lot, and so many people went through a lot. Yes, so thank you so much for taking the time. All the way from the United States and recording this interview. I hope this is not going to be the last, because there are also other topics that I would like to cover and are connected to psychology.
Oh, I don't think it will be the last. I think you're stuck with me. So
okay, so you'll be an ongoing guest coming back to this podcast. And of course, we'll see each other in person, definitely.
Most definitely. This was an honor and a blessing, and I look forward to sharing this interview with so many people far and wide.
Oh, yes, please do. So thank you, dear viewers and listeners, for being with us today. This podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. Don't forget to subscribe. You see my little self showing you where you need to push the button. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and of course you can support this podcast and help it continue. This was all for today. See you in the next episode. Until then, oh my. Bye everyone, and bye Jamie.
Bye.